My wife just told me she's pregnant, but she doesn't know I've had a vasectomy since I was 16. When my older brother accidentally got his girlfriend pregnant as a teen, my parents decided I couldn't make the same mistake. So on my 16th birthday, instead of taking me out for pizza and cake, my parents took me to a clinic to get a vasectomy. I didn't understand what vasectomy even meant until years later in the worst way possible. I was dating Stefani at the time, but after the third date, I knew I wanted to marry her and start a family. When I told my parents, they laughed. She told you she wanted 3 kids together? Son, you can't give her any kids. We made sure of it with your vasectomy, Dad explained bluntly. The truth felt like a sucker punch to the gut. I felt betrayed. I stopped speaking to my parents that week, but I couldn't tell Stefani about it, not yet. I was too terrified and embarrassed, so I kept dating her, got engaged, then married her, all while carrying this secret. But I promised myself I would tell her the truth someday when I was ready. But 8 months into marriage, she brought up the idea of starting a family. I told her gently, let's wait a few years and get settled, hoping it'd buy me more time to fix the problem. She looked disappointed, but always agreed to wait. And so for the past 6 months, I'd been hopping from doctor to doctor in secret, discussing reversal surgeries, getting turned away because the reversal success rate is almost impossible, but I kept hope. Then, by some miracle, 2 weeks ago, a surgeon emailed me back saying he was willing to try a new procedure with me. I was thrilled. The only thing I needed to do now was buy myself a little more time before I told her everything. That's when I found something strange. I found her birth control in the trash still half full, along with ovulation tests that clearly showed that she was trying to get pregnant, while telling me straight to my face that she was willing to wait. I mean, the irony of it was pretty sickening. Her best friend even started making jokes during our hangout about oops babies, and how accidents are still blessings, and we could never be too sure. I realized Stefani had been trying to trap me into finally having the baby she wanted while I was secretly sterile, but it didn't matter, because after the surgery, I could give her what she wanted. What I didn't realize was that she'd make it happen on her own. I had to leave town for a work convention for 4 days. When I got back, Stefani seemed different, more alive, happy, and hopeful. When I asked what changed, she mentioned her coworker Caitlin had been helping her out while I was gone, keeping her company. I was relieved. Maybe all she needed was some space and a friend to take her mind off things until my surgery. But that same night, I found Stefani sobbing on the couch. I sat down beside her, worried that something bad had happened when she suddenly held up 3 positive pregnancy tests with shaking hands. "We're pregnant!" she cheered, wrapping her arms around my neck as she continued crying in my ear. "I know it's scary, but we can do it. We'll be amazing parents together. I just know it," she whispered through her sniffles. I sat there stunned and dizzy. This was impossible. Before I could process anything, she was on the phone calling her mother and her sister and her best friend. She spent the rest of the day looking through baby supplies on Amazon, showing me videos on her phone to help prepare us for parenting, and even ordered me a World's Greatest Dad shirt to encourage me. But I couldn't feel happy because I knew I wasn't the father. But I couldn't tell her how I knew. When she was busy, I pulled up her tracking app and saw she'd been 6 weeks pregnant according to the dates. The exact same time I'd been out of town for a work convention. The same week she kept mentioning her coworker Caitlin, who was apparently over at the house helping her with an important project. I knew the truth but couldn't face it, until I came home 2 days later to find her sitting in the kitchen with a grim expression, holding a piece of mail, my vasectomy reversal surgery confirmation letter. She stared at me and asked in a quiet voice, "How long have you had a vasectomy?" I sat down beside her wearing the same grim expression. "Since I was 16, I told her, explaining how cruel my parents were, how I didn't have a choice. She looked down at the letter again, then at the positive pregnancy test proudly displayed on the counter, neither of us saying anything, but we both knew. And now, there was exactly one thing left to do. We sat there in the kitchen without saying anything for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The surgery letter sat on the table between us with my name printed across the top. The pregnancy test was still on the counter where she'd left it that morning, 3 pink lines that proved something impossible had happened. I kept staring at the letter, then at the test, then back at the letter. She did the same thing. Neither of us moved. Neither of us tried to explain or make excuses. We both knew what this meant. The kitchen clock ticked loud enough that I could count each second passing. I watched her hands shake as she picked up the letter and read it again, like maybe the words would change if she looked one more time. They didn't change. I finally made myself speak because the silence was making everything worse. I told her we needed to get a paternity test done. My voice came out steadier than I expected, almost calm. She looked up at me with tears running down her face and nodded slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't try to tell me it was somehow still mine. She didn't bring up miracles or medical mysteries. She just nodded and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. That night I grabbed my pillow and a blanket and went to the guest room. It was the first time in our whole marriage that we slept in different rooms. I lay there in the dark staring at the ceiling, trying to organize my thoughts into something that made sense. I started making lists in my head, things I knew for sure versus things I was just guessing about. I knew I'd had a vasectomy when I was 16. I knew it was permanent. I knew I'd been gone for 4 days at a work thing. I knew she was 6 weeks along based on what the app said. I knew the timing matched up exactly with when I was out of town. Those were facts. Everything else was just me trying to fill in the blanks. I kept separating what was real from what I'd been telling myself to feel better. The fantasy version where somehow this all worked out. The real version where my wife was having another man's baby. I didn't sleep much. The next morning I found her in the kitchen making coffee. She had her phone out and started showing me articles before I even sat down. She talked about how vasectomies can sometimes fail. She showed me stories about men who got their partners pregnant years after the surgery. She read me statistics about spontaneous reversals. I listened and drank my coffee and didn't interrupt. When she finally stopped talking, I told her we were still doing the paternity test. She looked at me for a long moment and then put her phone down. She didn't bring it up again after that. Later that same morning, she asked me why I never told her about the vasectomy before we got married. So I explained the whole thing. I told her how my older brother got his girlfriend pregnant when he was a teenager. I told her how my parents decided I couldn't make the same mistake. I told her how they took me to get the surgery on my 16th birthday, instead of taking me out for pizza like normal parents. I explained that I didn't even know what the word vasectomy meant until years later when I wanted to start a family with her. She looked shocked. She asked me over and over why I kept it secret. I admitted I was too ashamed. I was scared she'd leave me if she knew I couldn't give her kids. I was embarrassed about what my parents did to me. I kept thinking I'd find a way to fix it before I had to tell her the truth. She got quiet for a minute and then suggested maybe the surgery I had scheduled somehow worked early. Maybe my body knew I wanted kids so bad that it healed itself ahead of time. Maybe the doctor was wrong about how permanent it was. I watched her face while she talked and saw how much she wanted this to be true. It hurt to look at her desperate hope. I told her gently that medical stuff doesn't work that way. Bodies don't just heal themselves because we want them to. We needed to face what was really happening instead of making up stories that made us feel better. I spent the whole afternoon at my computer looking up information about paternity tests. I learned about different types and which ones hold up in court. I read about chain of custody testing where they document everything officially so nobody can mess with the results. I found a clinic across town that does the legal kind and called to make an appointment. They had an opening next Tuesday. I wrote down the date and time and address. When I came back downstairs, I told her when we were going. She just nodded. That evening, I sat in the guest room and made myself a promise. I was done hiding things about my body and my past. I was done protecting other people's feelings when it meant lying about my own truth. Whatever happened with this marriage, whatever happened next, I wasn't going to live in shame anymore. Not about the vasectomy. Not about what my parents did. Not about any of it. I was going to be honest even when it was hard. The next day, I called Owen Waters, the surgeon who did my original vasectomy and was supposed to do my reversal. I explained what happened with my wife's pregnancy. I told him I needed proof of my medical history. He said he'd put together all my records and write a letter confirming my status. He told me he was sorry I was going through this. Hearing him say that made everything feel more real somehow. Like it wasn't just happening in my head anymore. It was real enough that other people could see it too. I spent hours that night reading everything I could find about what happens when someone isn't the biological father. I looked up legal rights and financial responsibility. I read about birth certificates and how names get added. I learned about custody and child support. I read through forums where other men talked about finding out their kids weren't theirs. The information kept piling up until my brain felt too full. But I made myself keep reading. I needed to understand every possible thing that could happen. I needed to know my options before we went in for that test, even though I already knew what the results would say. The next few days turned into a strange routine where Stefani and I existed in the same space without really being together. I moved my stuff into the guest room down the hall. She kept the master bedroom. We crossed paths in the kitchen during breakfast, and sometimes in the hallway when we were both coming or going. The silence between us felt thick and uncomfortable. Neither of us knew what to say anymore. I realized we'd been living like strangers for longer than just these past few days. Maybe we'd been strangers the whole time and I just didn't want to see it. She tried to start conversations a few times, but I couldn't do it. Every time I looked at her, I thought about the baby that wasn't mine. One morning, she came downstairs with her phone and sat at the kitchen table across from me. She started scrolling through baby name websites and showing me options. She held the phone toward me with a hopeful smile and asked what I thought about certain names. I felt my stomach turn. I stood up from the table and walked out of the room without saying anything. She called after me, but I went upstairs and closed the guest room door. I couldn't sit there and plan for a child that belonged to someone else. The gap between her hopeful planning and my grief felt impossible to cross. She wanted to pretend everything was normal. I couldn't pretend anymore. Later that day, I opened my laptop and created a new document. I titled it Timeline and started writing down every date I could remember from the past 2 months. I wrote down when I left for the work convention. I noted the exact dates I was gone. I wrote down when I came back home. I added the date when she told me about the pregnancy. I calculated backwards from her tracking app to figure out when she would have gotten pregnant. The dates lined up exactly with my trip. Seeing it all written out in black and white made the pattern clear and undeniable. I saved the document in a folder labeled Legal. I called the clinic back the next morning to confirm our appointment for the chain of custody paternity test. The scheduler answered and verified our information. She explained the whole process to me step by step. She told me we'd both need to bring government IDs. She said they'd take photos of us for documentation. She explained they'd collect samples with witnesses present to maintain the chain of custody. She told me the results would take 7 to 10 business days after the test. I wrote down every single detail she gave me in a notebook. Having something concrete to hold on to helped when everything else felt uncertain and messy. I needed facts and procedures. I needed things I could control. The next step was figuring out my legal rights. I searched online for family law attorneys in the area and found Julian Waters. His website said he specialized in paternity cases and divorce. I called his office and scheduled a consultation for that week. When I met with Julian in his office, he asked me to explain the whole situation from the beginning. I told him about the vasectomy when I was 16. I explained about my wife's pregnancy. I showed him my timeline document. He listened carefully and took notes. He told me that if I wasn't the biological father, I had no legal obligation to the child. He explained that being married didn't automatically make me responsible if paternity testing proved otherwise. But then he asked me what I wanted for my marriage and my future. That question hit harder than I expected. I didn't have a clear answer yet. Julian said he could help me with whatever I decided. He also suggested I get official documentation of my vasectomy history to support my case. He gave me Owen Waters' contact information and said Owen could provide the medical records I needed. I called Owen's office that afternoon and explained what was happening. Owen remembered me from our previous consultations about the reversal surgery. He said he'd put together all my medical records from the original vasectomy. He offered to write a letter confirming I'd been sterile since age 16. When I went to pick up the documents a few days later, Owen handed me a thick envelope. Inside were detailed records from when I was 16. There was also a letter on official letterhead stating my medical history and current status. Reading through the paperwork validated everything I'd been saying, but it also made me angry all over again at my parents. They'd done this to me without my real consent. They'd taken away my choice. That evening, I brought up couples counseling to Stefani. Part of me thought we needed professional help to get through this. Part of me wanted a witness to whatever truth finally came out. She agreed right away. She looked relieved that I was willing to try to work through things. I wasn't sure yet if that's what I was actually doing. I just knew we couldn't keep living like this without some kind of structure or guidance. I found Aurelia Waters through my insurance provider's website. She specialized in marriage counseling and crisis intervention. I booked our first session for the following week. When we showed up at Aurelia's office, she had us sit on a couch across from her chair. She asked us each to explain why we were there. I went first and laid out the basic facts. Vasectomy at 16, wife's pregnancy, timeline that didn't add up, need for paternity testing. Stefani started crying before I even finished talking. Then Aurelia asked Stephanie to share her perspective. That's when Stefani admitted she'd stopped taking birth control 6 months ago without telling me. She said she thought if it just happened naturally, I wouldn't be upset about having a baby. She said she was tired of waiting. Hearing her say it out loud in front of a therapist made something break inside me. Whatever trust I'd been holding onto completely shattered in that moment. Aurelia didn't react with shock or judgment. She just nodded and made notes. Then she asked us what we needed to move forward. I said we needed the paternity test done properly with legal documentation. Aurelia helped us agree on the chain of custody prenatal test right there in her office. Having a neutral third party make it official somehow made it more real. Stefani agreed to all the terms without arguing. I think she was finally accepting that we needed real answers instead of hopeful stories. Before we left that first session, Aurelia helped us establish some rules for living together while we waited for results. Separate bedrooms, which we'd already started. A shared kitchen schedule so we wouldn't overlap. No baby talk around me. It felt cold and businesslike, but it was the only way I could function. We both agreed to the terms. We scheduled our next session for 2 weeks out. On the drive home, neither of us spoke. When we got back to the house, Stefani went straight to the master bedroom and I went to the guest room. I heard her door close. I closed mine too. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in the guest bed staring at the ceiling for hours before I finally gave up and turned on the lamp. I got out my laptop and started pulling together every document I had about my vasectomy. I created a folder on my desktop and named it Documentation. I copied in the medical records Owen had given me. I added the surgery confirmation letter that Stefani had found in the mail. I typed up a timeline with dates and events, trying to get everything organized in one place. When I was 16 and got the vasectomy. When I started dating Stefani. When we got married. When she stopped taking birth control without telling me. When I left for the convention. When she told me about the pregnancy. Seeing it all laid out in black and white made me feel less crazy. I had facts. I had proof. I had evidence that what I knew to be true was actually true. I saved everything and backed it up to 3 different places. Then I finally fell asleep around 4 in the morning with my laptop still open on the bed. The next evening, Stefani knocked on the guest room door. I opened it and she was holding her phone, looking hopeful and a little desperate. She showed me article after article about vasectomy failures. Stories about men who got their partners pregnant years after the procedure. Cases of spontaneous reversal where the tubes somehow reconnected on their own. She scrolled through medical forums and Reddit threads, pointing at comments from people claiming it happened to them. Her voice got higher and faster as she talked, like she was trying to convince both of us at the same time. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her I appreciated that she wanted to believe in a miracle. I said I understood why she was looking for hope. But then I told her we were going to trust the medical test, not internet stories from strangers. We were going to get the real answer from actual doctors with proper procedures. She stared at me for a long moment and then nodded slowly. She stopped showing me articles after that. A few days later, I realized I needed the original vasectomy records from when I was 16. Owen had given me copies from his files, but I wanted the complete documentation. I needed everything in one place. I called my dad and asked if he still had the paperwork from that clinic visit. The conversation was tense and uncomfortable. He asked why I needed it, and I told him I was getting my medical history together. He didn't ask any follow-up questions. Neither of us mentioned what they had actually done to me or why. Neither of us talked about the fact that they had taken away my choice when I was just a kid. He said he'd look through their files and send me copies. His voice sounded tight and defensive, but he agreed. We hung up after less than 5 minutes. That weekend I went to the grocery store to pick up some basics, since I'd been avoiding the kitchen when Stefani was around. I was in the cereal aisle when I saw Kylie pushing a cart toward me. She was Stefani's best friend, the one who'd made all those jokes about oops babies and happy accidents. When she spotted me, her whole face changed. She looked down at her cart and tried to turn around, but I'd already seen her. I kept walking toward her because I wasn't going to make it easy. When we got close, she mumbled a quick hello and wouldn't look at me directly. Her eyes darted to the shelves, the floor, anywhere but my face. I said hi back and kept my voice normal. We stood there for an awkward few seconds, and then she made some excuse about forgetting something and hurried away. I realized Stefani must have told her everything. Kylie knew about the vasectomy and the pregnancy, and the timeline that didn't add up. She felt guilty about her role in encouraging Stefani to trap me with a baby. Watching her practically run away from me made the whole situation feel even more real. The following Monday, I called the clinic back to schedule the actual chain of custody test. The scheduler walked me through the process again, and we picked a date for the following week. She explained they'd need both of us there for the intake and sample collection. She said results would take 7 to 10 business days after that. I wrote down all the information and thanked her. After I hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand, feeling anxious and relieved at the same time. The appointment felt too soon and not soon enough. Part of me wanted to get it over with and have concrete proof. Part of me wanted to delay it forever and stay in this strange space where I knew the truth but didn't have official confirmation yet. I knew once we had those results, everything would change in ways I couldn't take back. That That evening, Stefani found me in the living room and suggested maybe we could just use a cheaper home paternity test instead of going to the clinic. She tried to make it sound practical, like she was worried about the cost. She said those mail-in kits were just as accurate and way more affordable. I looked at her and said no immediately. I told her we were doing the legal test with proper chain of custody procedures. I explained that I needed documentation that would hold up in court if it came to that. Her face fell and she nodded without arguing. I could see in her eyes that she understood what I was really saying. I didn't trust her anymore. I needed everything official and verified because I couldn't take her word for anything. She left the room without another word. The next day, I called a friend from work and asked if I could stay at his place for a few days. He said yes right away without asking too many questions. I started packing a bag in the guest room, folding clothes and gathering toiletries. It felt like I was practicing for something bigger. Every item I put in the bag felt significant, like I was deciding what parts of my life I wanted to take with me and what I was ready to leave behind. I wasn't sure if I was coming back after a few days or if this was the beginning of something permanent. I zipped up the bag and set it by the door. When our second counseling session came around the following week, Aurelia asked me to talk about the vasectomy and how it had affected me. I started explaining the shame I'd carried for years about my body. I talked about feeling broken and less than other men. I described the fear and embarrassment that had kept me from telling Stefani the truth. Aurelia listened carefully and then helped me name what my parents had actually done. She used words like violated my consent and took away my bodily autonomy. She explained that what happened to me at 16 was a form of abuse, even if my parents thought they were protecting me. Saying it all out loud in front of Stefani made me realize how deep that wound really went. I'd been carrying this damage for over a decade, and it had shaped every relationship choice I'd made. Then Aurelia turned to address what Stefani had done. She said directly that stopping birth control without my knowledge was also a violation of consent. She explained that reproductive decisions have to be mutual, and that trying to get pregnant without telling me was a betrayal of trust. Hearing a professional name it that way made me feel vindicated. Someone else could see what had been done to me, but I also felt heartbroken because my wife, the person I'd chosen to build a life with, had done this to me. Near the end of the session, I turned to Stefani and asked her directly about the timeline with the co-worker during my trip. I kept my voice calm and factual. I told her I needed to understand what happened and when. I explained I wasn't trying to punish her, but I deserved to know the truth about my own life. She looked at me with tears starting to form, but I didn't look away. She wiped her eyes and started talking, but her words came out choppy and unclear. She said she couldn't remember all the details because she'd been so stressed with me gone and feeling lonely in the house. She mentioned the co-worker's name was actually Caitlin with a Y, not Caitlin, and that they'd hung out a few times during that week. When I pressed for specifics about what days and what they did, she got defensive and said she wasn't on trial. She told me she was trying to be honest, but I was making it impossible by interrogating her like she was a criminal. I felt my frustration building, but I made myself stay quiet. I realized pushing her right now would just make her shut down more. I decided to let it go and wait for the paternity test to force the real truth out. Aurelia noticed the tension and suggested we take a break from that topic for now. The session ended soon after, and we drove home in separate cars. 3 days later, we pulled into the parking lot of the medical clinic for the chain of custody paternity test. The building looked plain and professional with gray siding and tinted windows. We walked in together but stood apart in the waiting area. A woman at the front desk handed us clipboards with intake forms. I filled out my personal information while Stefani did the same at the other end of the waiting room. When they called us back, a technician in blue scrubs checked both our photo IDs against the forms. She took pictures of us with a digital camera and had us sign multiple consent documents. She explained the whole process would be witnessed and documented for legal purposes. She led us into a small exam room and swabbed the inside of my cheek with a long cotton stick. Then she did the same for Stefani. She labeled each sample container with our names and ID numbers while we watched. She had us initial the labels to confirm they were correct. The whole thing felt cold and official, like we were evidence in a crime instead of a married couple. I felt numb watching her seal the samples in plastic bags and fill out chain of custody paperwork. She told us results would take 7 to 10 business days, and they'd call with the information. We left the clinic and got back in our separate cars without saying anything to each other. The next afternoon, I sat in Julian Waters' office going over what would happen once we had the test results. His office had dark wood furniture and law books lining the walls. He pulled out a folder and walked me through the different possible outcomes, even though we both knew what the results would show. He explained that if I wasn't the biological father, I had no legal obligation to the child. He talked about separation agreements and how we'd divide property and finances. He said that in our state, a child born during marriage is automatically assumed to be the husband's child unless we take legal action. He explained we'd need to file paperwork to remove my name from the birth certificate and establish that I have no parental rights or responsibilities. He mentioned that Stefani would need to identify the biological father, so that person could be listed instead. He asked if I wanted to pursue a divorce right away or start with a legal separation. I told him I needed to see the test results first before making that choice, even though I already knew the answer. He nodded and said that was reasonable. He gave me homework to think about what I wanted in terms of splitting assets and whether I wanted to keep the house or sell it. His straightforward approach helped me feel less overwhelmed by all the legal details. 2 days later, my phone rang with my dad's number. I almost didn't answer, but I picked up on the 4th ring. He immediately asked why I was dredging up the past and requesting old medical records. His voice had that defensive edge that made my shoulders tense up. I told him calmly that I needed the documentation for legal reasons. He wanted to know what kind of legal reasons, and I said I wasn't ready to explain everything yet. My mom got on the line and asked if we were being sued or if something was wrong. I repeated that I just needed copies of the vasectomy paperwork from when I was 16. Dad said they'd have to dig through old files and it might take time. I could hear the annoyance in his voice, like I was being unreasonable for asking. Mom said they'd look for the records, parents, but she didn't understand why this was coming up now after all these years. I thanked them and ended the call before they could ask more questions. Their tone made it clear they thought I was making a big deal out of nothing. 4 days after that conversation, my mom called my cell phone in the evening. I was sitting on my friend's couch when I saw her name pop up. She sounded different this time, quieter and less defensive. She said she needed to talk to me without Dad around. She admitted she'd always felt guilty about the vasectomy decision. She told me that she'd wanted to wait until I was older, but Dad had been so worried after what happened with my brother. She said she went along with it because she didn't want to fight with him, but she'd regretted it for years. She told me she found some of the medical records in an old filing cabinet, and she was sending them to me. She said there was a note included where she tried to explain herself better. Her voice cracked when she said she wished they'd handled things differently. I didn't know what to say, so I just thanked her for sending the papers. After we hung up, I felt this weird mix of anger and empathy. Part of me wanted to stay mad at her, but another part felt sad that she'd been carrying guilt for so long. The envelope from my mom arrived 2 days later. I opened it at my friend's kitchen table and pulled out a stack of photocopied medical forms. The paperwork was from the clinic where they took me on my 16th birthday. I read through the consent forms my parents had signed. There were multiple paragraphs explaining that vasectomy was considered a permanent form of birth control. The language talked about irreversibility and how reversal success rates were very low. I saw my dad's signature at the bottom and my mom's next to it. Looking at those forms made me think about that 16-year-old version of myself who didn't understand what was happening. I remembered sitting in that clinic waiting room thinking I was just getting a regular checkup. I felt grief for that kid who trusted his parents and didn't know they were taking away his choice to have children someday. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the papers and feeling the weight of what had been done to me. At our third counseling session the following week, Aurelia started by asking how we were both doing with everything. The session felt heavier than the previous ones. She said she wanted to shift our focus to accountability and what each of us needed to move forward. She asked Stefani to talk about her choices and their impact on me. Stefani started crying almost immediately, but Aurelia gently pushed her to stay with the conversation. She asked me to talk about how the betrayal felt and what I needed from Stefani now. The conversation got harder and more honest than it had been before. I could feel us both finally facing what we'd done to each other instead of avoiding it. Aurelia didn't let either of us hide behind excuses or deflect blame. She kept bringing us back to the core issues of trust and consent and honesty. During that same session, Stefani admitted something new that made my stomach drop. She said she'd actually stopped taking birth control 8 months ago, not 6 months like she told me before. She said she'd been scared to tell me the full truth because it made her actions look worse. I felt whatever trust I had left just crumble completely. I realized she'd been lying in layers, only admitting pieces of truth when she got cornered. Each new confession made me wonder what else she was still hiding. Aurelia asked her why she kept adjusting the timeline, and Stefani said she was ashamed. I pointed out that shame didn't excuse lying, and that every time she changed her story, it made everything worse. Stefani nodded and apologized again, but the apologies felt empty now. I looked at Stefani and told her I needed to say something I'd been thinking about for days. I said that what bothered me most wasn't just the lying or even the cheating. It was the entitlement behind all of it. I explained that she'd decided she could make reproductive choices for both of us because she wanted a baby badly enough. I told her that stopping birth control without telling me was a violation of my consent, just like what my parents did to me was a violation. I said that her fear of losing me didn't justify taking away my right to make decisions about my own life and body. She started crying hard and saying she knew she'd messed up. I stayed calm and kept my voice steady. I told her I understood she was scared, but that didn't make what she did okay. I said that if she'd just been honest with me about wanting kids so badly, we could have figured something out together. Instead, she chose to lie and manipulate, and now we were here. Aurelia nodded and said that was an important point about consent and partnership that we needed to sit with. Near the end of the session, I asked Stefani again about the coworker and how they met. She took a breath and started explaining. She said that during my convention trip, Kylie had invited her to a work happy hour at a bar downtown. She said Kylie introduced her to several people from her office, including someone named Renee Parkinson. She described it like it was just a casual night out with friends. She said they all hung out at the bar for a few hours, and then people started leaving. The way she told the story sounded rehearsed and incomplete. I could hear the gaps where she was leaving things out. She kept using vague language like they hung out and they talked and they had drinks together. I didn't push for more details right then because I knew the paternity test would fill in what she wasn't saying. But listening to her try to make it sound innocent and accidental just made me more certain that she knew exactly what she'd done. The session ended and we scheduled the clinic appointment for the next morning. Stefani and I drove there in silence, the tension between us making even the radio feel too loud. At the clinic, we went through the intake process with a technician who checked our IDs and took photos for the chain of custody paperwork. The technician explained that Stefani would need to provide a blood sample for the non-invasive prenatal paternity test. She rolled up her sleeve and the technician drew several vials of blood while I sat in the corner chair watching. The technician labeled everything carefully and had us both sign forms confirming we witnessed the collection. Then she told us results would take 7 to 10 business days to process. I felt my stomach drop at those words because it meant waiting another week or more in this awful limbo. The technician handed us a pamphlet about the testing process and scheduled a follow-up appointment to review results. We walked back to the car and I realized my whole life was just suspended, waiting for confirmation of what I already knew in my gut. The drive home was quiet again, and I dropped Stefani off before heading to my individual session with Aurelia that afternoon. I'd been avoiding telling friends about any of this because I wasn't ready to make it public yet. Sitting in Aurelia's office alone felt different from the couple's sessions. She asked how I was really doing, and I admitted I felt humiliated and betrayed in ways I couldn't fully explain. She listened without judgment as I talked through everything, from my parents forcing the vasectomy to Stefani Stefani's lies about birth control to this pregnancy that couldn't be mine. Aurelia helped me name the shame I'd been carrying for years about my body and my fertility. She pointed out that both my parents and Stefani had violated my consent in different ways. Having one space where I could be completely honest without worrying about anyone else's feelings was a relief I didn't know I needed. When I got home that evening, my phone rang with my dad's number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. My dad's voice was stiff and formal as he said they wanted to meet and talk like adults about this situation. I felt apprehensive immediately because talking to my parents about anything real always ended badly, but I agreed to meet them, adding that it needed to be on my terms with clear boundaries about what we'd discuss. My dad sounded surprised that I was setting conditions, but he agreed. We scheduled to meet at a coffee shop the following week. After I hung up, I felt anxious about seeing them and what they might say to defend themselves. At my next session with Aurelia, I told her about the upcoming meeting with my parents. She spent the hour coaching me on boundary statements and helping me practice what I needed to say. We went through different scenarios where they might get defensive or try to minimize what they'd done. Aurelia had me practice saying out loud how their decision to force a vasectomy on me affected my entire adult life. She reminded me that I didn't owe them forgiveness or comfort, that this meeting was about me expressing my truth. We practiced me staying calm, even if they got upset or tried to make it about their feelings. By the end of the session, I felt more prepared but still nervous. That same week, Stefani and I had another couples session where things finally broke open. I asked her directly about the timeline with the coworker again, keeping my voice steady. She looked down at her hands for a long time before finally admitting there was one encounter with Renee Parkinson, the coworker Kylie had introduced her to at that happy hour. She said it was just once and she immediately regretted it afterward. Hearing her finally say it out loud made me feel physically sick, like I might throw up right there in Aurelia's office. But I also felt relieved in a strange way to finally have a concrete truth after weeks of her being vague and evasive. I asked if she'd told Renee about the pregnancy yet. Stefani shook her head and admitted she hadn't contacted him. I felt anger rise up in my chest and told her she was still avoiding responsibility. I said that Renee had a right to know he might be a father, regardless of what happened with our marriage. Stefani started crying and said she was scared to tell him. I stayed firm and said that wasn't an excuse, that she needed to face what she'd done. Aurelia supported this and said Stefani needed to inform Renee soon. 9 days after the blood draw, I got a call from the clinic saying my results were ready. I drove there immediately, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The receptionist handed me a sealed envelope, and I walked out to my car in the parking lot. I sat there and opened it, reading the paternity test results that showed 0% probability that I was the biological father. I read the report 3 times, staring at the numbers and the scientific language that confirmed what I'd known all along. Even though I expected it, seeing it written down in black and white made everything real in a way it wasn't before. I sat in that parking lot for almost an hour, just holding the paper and trying to process that my marriage was truly over. When I got home that evening, I found Stefani in the living room. I told her I wanted a separation. She immediately started to argue, saying we could work through this and that counseling was helping. I stayed calm and firm, explaining that too much trust had been broken between us. I said I needed space to figure out what I wanted for my future. Stefani cried and asked me not to give up on us, but I didn't waver. I told her I'd already contacted Julian about next steps. The next day, I met with Julian at his office. He drafted a temporary separation agreement that outlined living arrangements and financial responsibilities. We went through every detail, like who would stay in the house and how we'd split bills and what timeline we were looking at. Going through all the legal specifics felt numbingly practical, like I was organizing someone else's life instead of taking apart my own marriage. Julian was professional and thorough, making sure I understood every clause before signing anything. Then we discussed the birth certificate and parental rights. Julian explained that since Stefani and I were married, I would automatically be listed as the father on the birth certificate unless we took legal steps to prevent it. He said I needed to be very clear about what I wanted. I told him directly that I didn't want any legal or financial responsibility for a child that wasn't mine biologically. Julian nodded and made notes about filing the necessary paperwork to protect me from being assigned paternity by default. He said we'd need to involve Renee at some point to establish his rights and responsibilities as the biological father. The meeting lasted 2 hours, and by the end I felt exhausted, but also relieved to have a clear legal path forward. That same evening I called Owen about my surgery. I explained everything that had happened with the paternity test and the separation. I told him I needed to postpone the reversal because my life was too unstable right now to make decisions about future fertility. Owen listened quietly and said he understood completely. He told me the option would be there whenever I was ready, which made me feel less like I was giving up on everything. Before we hung up, Owen started talking about other possibilities for the future. He explained that even with my vasectomy being so old, there were still options like sperm retrieval procedures and IVF if I eventually wanted biological children. Hearing that there were still paths forward helped me separate hope for my future from the pain of my current situation. I thanked him and ended the call feeling like I had one less thing to worry about. The next day, I drove to my parents' house for the meeting we'd scheduled. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel the whole way there. When I walked in, they were sitting at the kitchen table looking nervous. I sat down across from them and forced myself to start talking. I told them directly how their decision to force a vasectomy on me when I was 16 had harmed my entire life. My voice shook, but I kept going, explaining how it violated my bodily autonomy and took away choices that should have been mine to make. I demanded they acknowledge what they did, instead of defending their intentions or making excuses. My dad looked down at the table, and my mom had tears in her eyes. They both sat quiet for a long minute before my dad finally spoke. He admitted they made the decision out of fear after what happened with my brother. My mom added that they didn't consider how it would affect me long term, or how wrong it was to make that choice for me. They both agreed to seek therapy to understand why why they thought they had the right to do that. I accepted their words with cautious hope, knowing it wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. When I got home, Stefani was waiting in the living room. I told her she needed to contact Renee about the pregnancy and his biological connection to the baby. She looked scared, but nodded and said she would. I didn't trust her completely, so I called Julian right there and asked him to document her commitment in case she backed out, and I needed to inform Renee myself. Julian made a note in his file and confirmed he had it on record. After that call, I went to my laptop and started removing myself from all the baby planning. I deleted the shared Amazon baby registry we'd started. I left the group text with her family where they'd been discussing baby shower plans. I unsubscribed from all the parenting apps she'd added me to without asking. Each deletion felt like letting go of a future I'd wanted, but was never going to have. It hurt, but it also felt necessary, like I was finally accepting reality instead of holding on to false hope. A few days later, during one of our scheduled house conversations, Stefani told me she'd started attending prenatal counseling sessions. She explained they were focused on single parenting preparation and accountability. I could see in her face that she was starting to accept the reality that she'd be raising this child without me. She looked sad, but also more grounded than she had in weeks. We spent the next week working out logistics for me moving out. We sat at the dining table with notebooks and divided up furniture piece by piece. We separated our bank accounts and credit cards. We established a timeline for when I'd be fully moved out. I found an apartment across town that was available immediately and signed a lease the same day I viewed it. Having my own space secured made the separation feel manageable instead of overwhelming. On Saturday, I drove to the thrift store with a bag of donations. At the bottom of the bag was the shirt Stefani had ordered me, the one that said "World's Greatest Dad" on the front. I dropped it in the donation bin and watched it disappear with all the other discarded clothes. Letting it go felt sad but also necessary, like I was releasing the father role I'd briefly imagined, along with all the false hope that came with it. That evening, I sat down at my computer and wrote a boundaries memo to my parents. I outlined clear conditions for ongoing contact moving forward. They needed to attend therapy consistently and actually work on understanding what they did. They needed to acknowledge the harm without getting defensive or making excuses. They needed to respect my decisions about my body and my life from now on. I read it over 3 times to make sure I'd said everything I needed to say. Then I attached it to an email and hit send. Watching it leave my outbox made me feel strong and clear, like I was finally stating my needs instead of just accepting whatever they decided was best for me. 2 days later, Stefani knocked on my bedroom door and asked if we could talk. I followed her to the living room where she sat on the edge of the couch looking nervous. She told me she'd contacted Renee and explained everything about the pregnancy. He was shocked at first, but after thinking it over, he agreed to be involved as the biological father. She showed me text messages on her phone where he asked about doctor appointments and said he wanted to support the baby. I felt this weird combination of relief and sadness wash over me. Relief because the baby would have a father who wanted to be there, but grief because it made everything feel so final. My marriage was really ending. There was no going back from this point. The next week we met with Julian to file the legal separation papers. We sat across from each other at his conference table and went through every section together. We divided our shared bank account 50-50. We agreed I'd take my car and she'd keep hers. We split the furniture list we'd made earlier. The whole process felt businesslike, but also deeply sad, like we were dismantling our life together piece by piece with check marks and signatures. When we got to the part about the baby, Julian made it clear in the paperwork that I had no legal or financial responsibility since I wasn't the biological father. Stefani signed without argument. We both acknowledged out loud that we'd hurt each other in ways that couldn't be fixed, that too much trust had been broken on both sides. Julian witnessed our signatures and said he'd file everything with the court by end of week. That Saturday, I got in my car and just drove with no destination in mind. I took back roads through neighborhoods I'd never seen before, windows down, radio off, just thinking. After an hour, I pulled into a gas station parking lot and called Aurelia's office to schedule my next therapy appointment. The receptionist booked me for 2 weeks out. Then I opened my phone calendar and scrolled ahead 6 months. I found an empty day and typed in a note to call Owen about fertility options. The road ahead felt uncertain and kind of scary, but I was building a life based on truth and clear boundaries now, and that felt like enough for right now. That's the story and the small lesson inside it. Hopefully it gave you something to think about or maybe something to try. Either way, that's what makes sharing worth it. Subscribe and let's keep learning through these together.